The great poet and prophet Maya Angelou understood well the power of story. She once declared, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you." We've seen so many attempts lately by the religious and political right to suppress the true stories of this country. The religious and political right say, stop talking about race and America's relationship to it. Stop with all this DEI. America isn't a racist country. Stop, they say, stop saying that slavery is America's original sin. Stop saying we walk on stolen land. Stop being anti-American. Stop trashing America. Give us the myth of America, not the reality of America. At the very moment when the truth about race and America was finally beginning to see the light of day and being discussed widely by white people, at the very moment we had an opportunity created by our 2020 summer of racial reckoning after the slow and agonizing murder of George Floyd, just when some of us thought we might have a real opportunity for transparency and change, states like Florida, Texas, Missouri, and too many others are pushing truth back into the closet and slamming the door shut on history. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. If we can't tell the true story, America will continue to be in agony from the inability to create the deep and lasting change that Dr. Martin Luther King dreamed about. The religious and political right know the power of story. They know that whoever sets the narrative wins. Whoever sets the story on social media wins. Wins the election, wins the legislation, wins the fight. One of the stories that gets increasingly rewritten and whitewashed this time of year is the story of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. While he was alive, he was one of the most hated people in America and considered by the government, by the FBI, to be one of the most dangerous. But you'd never know that if you attend many of the MLK celebrations tomorrow, especially in white suburbs. King will be reduced to a dream of a black child and a white child peacefully holding hands, walking into the sunset. A dream achieved. Yeah. In the preface to his book, The Radical King, Cornel West writes, "King indeed had a dream. It was what the quest for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness looked like for people enslaved and Jim Crowed, terrorized, traumatized, and stigmatized by American laws and American citizens." He goes on to say the litmus test for realizing King's dream was neither a black face in the White House nor a black presence on Wall Street. Rather, the fulfillment of his dream was for all poor and working people to live lives of decency and dignity. Would you say that last part with me? The fulfillment of his dream was for all poor and working people to live lives of decency and dignity, dream not achieved. By the time, Cornel West writes, by the time that he was assassinated, King's dream of a more free and democratic America and world had morphed into what was, in his own words, quote, a nightmare, made due to because of the persistence of racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. King called America, quote, a sick society. At one point, King cried out in despair, "I have found out that all I have been doing in trying to correct the system in America has been in vain. I am trying to get at the roots of it to see just what ought to be done. The whole thing will have to be done away with." Cornel West continues, for King, dissent did not mean disloyalty. In fact, dissent was a high form of patriotism. When he said that the U.S. government was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, he was not trashing America. He was telling the painful truth about a country that he deeply loved. King was never anti-American. He was always anti-injustice in America and everywhere else as well. Cornel West adds, the response of the radical King can be put into one word: revolution. And we get slide 111. Revolution. A revolution in our priorities, a revolution, a reevaluation of our values, and a fundamental transformation of our way of thinking and living that promotes the transfer of power from oligarchs to everyday people and ordinary citizens. That was King's dream. Could that statement be ever more true than today, on the eve of tomorrow's inauguration, bought in part by Elon Musk and glommed onto by other high-tech billionaire opportunists? We cannot let them take from us the true story of Dr. Martin Luther King. His critique and clarion cry was not only against racism, but also against poverty, militarism, materialism, and greed. Greed for money, greed for power. As a Unitarian Universalist, I find spiritual rejuvenation in the true story of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I also honor where the story of Dr. King overlaps with the story of Unitarian Universalism. In 1966, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was invited to address the national gathering of Unitarian Universalists at that year's General Assembly. 1 year prior, in 1965, there had been the bloody beating of black people in Selma as they tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge on their march to Montgomery, Alabama. Dr. King knew that more Unitarian Universalists responded to his call for people of faith to come to Selma than any other denomination in the country. Two-thirds of all Unitarian Universalist ministers in the country showed up in Selma to march with Dr. King. One of them, the Reverend James Reeb, died there after being beaten by racists. Another Unitarian Universalist, Viola Liuzzo, was shot in the head and killed by the Ku Klux Klan while driving returning marchers to the Selma airport. Given his study of religion, I'm sure Dr. King would have known of other connections between Unitarian Universalism and the struggle for civil rights. I'm pretty sure Dr. King would have known that in 1785, the first Universalist congregation in this country had a black man, Gloucester Dalton, as a founding member. Dr. King would have known that the Universalists spoke out against slavery in the 1790s, long before most other religious bodies did so. Dr. King would have known that prior to the Civil War, many prominent Unitarians worked tirelessly for the abolition of slavery, including Lydia Marie Child, William Lloyd Garrison, Margaret Fuller, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Theodore Parker. Theodore Parker, a Unitarian, also helped pay for John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. I'm sure King knew that the influence of Unitarian minister, the Reverend Thomas Starr King, was responsible for keeping California slave-free when it entered the Union as a new state. King also knew that in 1909, Unitarians Mary White Ovington and Reverend John Hines were two of the founders of the NAACP. There was also Unitarian Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, the black author whose investigative reporting in the mid-1800s exposed the truth about widespread lynching of innocent black men. She was one of the first black women to be published in this country. Equally powerful was Unitarian Fanny Barrier Williams, a black activist who in 1893 addressed the World Parliament on Religion being held as part of the Chicago World's Fair. Her speech calling for white Christian churches to work for justice for black Americans made her famous, and she spent the rest of her life working for equal access to education and opportunity for black people. So all of this history, all the impact of all these Unitarian ancestors were present as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. strode to the podium at the 1966 General Assembly and began his remarks to the gathered Unitarian Universalists. King said, "There are those wonderful moments in life when you speak before a group that is so near and dear to you that you don't feel like you have to engage in the art of persuasion. You don't feel like you are in the midst of strangers. You know that you are with friends. I can assure you that I feel that way tonight." But then, the radical King quickly changed gears and delivered a cutting call to action to this majority white denomination. Knowing their unconscious racism, he challenged them not to rest comfortably on the laurels of their liberal leanings. King declared, "One of the great misfortunes of history is that all too many individuals and institutions find themselves in a great period of change and yet fail to achieve the new attitudes and outlooks that the new situation demands. There is nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution." Could you say that with me? There is nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution. And, said King, there can be no denying the fact that a social revolution is taking place in our world today. The great question is, what do we do when we find ourselves in such a period? The church has a great responsibility, because when the church is true to its nature, it stands as a moral guardian of the community and of society. He said, "It is always the role of the church to broaden horizons, to challenge the status quo, and to question and break mores if necessary." I'm sure that we all agree that a church has a major role to play in this period of social change. King went on to say, "There are some things in our nation and in our world to which I'm proud to be maladjusted. And I call upon you to be maladjusted to these things until the good society is realized. I never intend to adjust myself to segregation and discrimination. I never intend to become adjusted to religious bigotry. I never tend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few and leave millions of people perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of prosperity." King then said, "I must honestly say, however much criticism it brings, that I never intend to adjust myself to the madness of militarism and to the self-defeating effects of physical violence. In a day when ballistic missiles are carving highways of death through the stratosphere, no nation can win a war. No nation can win a war." Dr. King said, "It is no longer a choice between nonviolence and violence. It is now a choice between nonviolence and non-existence." Dr. King ended his long speech with words that ring true for the moment in time we are facing today, tomorrow, and in the weeks and months and years to come. Dr. King looked at the Unitarian Universalists gathered in that great hall in 1966, but he could have been looking at us today, and he said, "Let me say in conclusion that I have not despaired of the future. I firmly believe we can solve these problems. I know that there are still difficult days ahead, and they are days of glorious opportunity. And we can sing, 'We shall overcome,' because somehow we know the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We shall overcome because philosopher Carlyle is right when he said, 'No lie can live forever.' We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth crushed will rise again. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope." Amen. My dear ones, as tomorrow dawns and an oath of office is administered, remember these words Dr. Martin Luther King spoke to our fellow Unitarian Universalists in 1966. "No lie can live forever. Truth crushed will rise again. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a story, our story of hope." Que así sea, bendito sea. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.